Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. September 19th, 1944, a date veiled in fog and tension. Imagine standing there near Arracourt, France, as the morning mist clings to the fields like a living thing. Through that pale curtain, shapes shift and vanish. Somewhere beyond, unseen but deadly, the Panthers are waiting. The pride of German armor, their sloped steel hides deflecting American shells as if swatting away raindrops. Inside one of the Shermans, First Lieutenant Merwin Marston of the 37th Tank Battalion leans against the cold metal rim of his turret. His gunner squints through the periscope, sweeping the murky landscape ahead. They've heard the warnings. The Panthers are out there, and engaging them head-on has been a death sentence for many crews. But none of them know that buried deep in their ammunition rack lies something extraordinary. 6 rounds that will change everything. 6 AIM-93 high-velocity, armor-piercing shells. Each one hides a tungsten carbide core, dense, gleaming, and lethal. With these rounds, the modest Sherman, so often derided as outgunned and under-armored, could suddenly strike like a giant killer. What the Germans will soon discover, with horror and disbelief, is that even their vaunted Panthers are no longer untouchable. The shock of this revelation would ripple through German armored forces, undermining their confidence and forcing them to rethink what invincible truly means. But this story, this quiet revolution in warfare, did not begin amid the fog of France. Its roots lie thousands of miles away in the laboratories and factories of the United States. There, metallurgists and ballistic engineers labored with urgency and precision, driven by one question: how do you pierce armor that seems unbreakable? At the dawn of 1944, the U.S. Army faced a crisis its planners had not foreseen. The M4 Sherman, the dependable workhorse of American armored divisions, was meeting an adversary it could not reliably defeat from the front. The German Panther, born from lessons learned on the Eastern Front against the Soviet T-34, combined a 75mm high-velocity cannon with an 80mm glacis plate angled at 55 degrees. That slope transformed its effective thickness to roughly 140mm, a wall of steel that seemed impervious to standard American weapons. U.S. intelligence had gravely underestimated both the number and the quality of Panthers in German service. When the Allies stormed ashore in Normandy in June 1944, nearly 38% of German tanks in the theater were Panthers. Not the handful expected, but hundreds of sleek, lethal predators. Many were crewed by green soldiers, yet their armor made them formidable opponents. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun, as reliable, familiar, but outdated, could not penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any range. The shells would ricochet harmlessly off the sloped plate, a cruel reminder of the technological gap that had opened. Meanwhile, the Panther's long-barreled gun could destroy a Sherman from more than 2 kilometers away. Even the newly introduced 76mm SM-1 gun, arriving in frontline units by July 1944, offered little relief. With standard M62 armor-piercing rounds, it could punch through 109mm of steel at 1,000 meters, deadly against Panzer IVs and assault guns, but futile against the Panther's front. There was, in theory, a narrow, weak point: the gun mantlet. Yet to strike it, a Sherman had to close to within 100 meters, point-blank range, where the Panther's superior firepower turned any attack into near suicide. The gun itself wasn't the real issue, it was the ammunition it fired. And so began the American quest to forge a new kind of round, one that could transform the familiar Sherman into something altogether more dangerous. But even the story of the 76mm gun's adoption had been mired in bureaucracy and hesitation. By the time the first M4 Shermans equipped with the 76mm M1 gun rolled off production lines in January 1944, the war in Europe was already changing, faster than American planners had dared imagine. April 10, 1944, Britain, rows of freshly painted M4A1 76. Shermans gleamed under the pale spring sky, their new 76mm guns jutting forward like the spears of a modern phalanx. 130 of them had arrived, ready for the great gamble of Normandy. And yet, when the invasion began 2 months later, not a single one rolled onto the beaches. Why? The reasons were maddeningly simple and tragically short-sighted. Tank crews hadn't had enough time to train with the new gun. Logistics officers fretted about the headaches of supplying two types of ammunition to the front. And perhaps most dangerously, senior commanders believed the older 75mm gun would be good enough for whatever the Germans could throw at them. It was a gamble rooted in optimism, and it would cost dearly. By early July 1944, the reality in Normandy shattered those illusions. Reports flooded in from the field, each one grimmer than the last. Sherman crews were being picked off by Panthers they couldn't kill, their shells bouncing harmlessly off the German tank's armor. On July the 2nd, the situation reached the highest levels of command. When General Dwight Eisenhower heard that the 76mm gun still couldn't defeat the Panthers, his disbelief turned to fury. "You mean our 76 won't knock these Panthers out?" he demanded. "Why, I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war." Witnesses later recalled that he continued with sharper words, angered that ordnance officials had promised him a weapon capable of facing anything Germany fielded. A formal board convened on July 12th confirmed what every tank crewman already knew in his bones: American guns could not penetrate a Panther's front armor. Within hours, General Omar Bradley issued the order: every 76mm Sherman sitting in Britain was to be rushed to the front. Their debut came on July 25th during Operation Cobra. 102 of the new Shermans rolled into battle. Hopes were high. Reality was not kind. Yes, the 70mm gun was better, but not enough. Against the Panther's frontal armor, it still struggled. The only viable tactics were to circle for a flank shot or aim for the gun mantle at close range, both options deadly when your opponent could kill you from 2 kilometers away. The breakthrough, when it came, did not emerge from tactics, but from science, from metallurgy and physics. By July 1944, American ordnance engineers had unveiled a new round that would change the game: the T4, soon standardized as the M93 HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing. Unlike traditional steel-capped projectiles, the M93 was something new, almost elegant in its simplicity. Inside its sleek aluminum shell lay a dense tungsten carbide core, one of the hardest substances on Earth. The design concentrated impact energy into a tiny point, allowing it to punch through armor that had once seemed untouchable. It was light, fast, and devastating. The results were astounding. The M93 left the barrel at 136 meters per second, compared to 792 for the standard M62 round. That extra 244 meters per second wasn't just a number. It was the difference between survival and death. At 1,000 yards, about 914 meters, the HVAP could pierce 106 foot of armor angled at 10 degrees, enough to threaten even the Panther's most formidable defenses. Suddenly, the German tank's gun mantlet, that thick, curved shield of cast steel, 100 millimeters on early models and up to 120 millimeters on later variants, was no longer invincible. Sherman crews, who once had to risk suicidal flanking maneuvers, could now strike from ranges of nearly a kilometer. For the first time, they had a fighting chance. Yet brilliance in design was only half the battle. Production posed an entirely different challenge, one measured not in engineering, but in resources. The M93's power came from tungsten carbide, a material harder than steel but rarer than gold in wartime supply chains. Before the war, China had produced over a third of the world's tungsten, and by 1944, it remained the Allies' primary source. But tungsten was in demand everywhere, for machine tools, armor plate hardening, and other types of anti-tank ammunition. Each 72mm HVAP round required roughly 0.8 kilograms of tungsten carbide. A single Sherman carrying 6 of them consumed almost 5 kilograms of this precious metal. In 1944, China produced about 10,000 metric tons of tungsten concentrates, a quantity stretched thin across all Allied industries. America supplemented this with smaller domestic sources in Colorado, Nevada, and California, but the supply never matched demand. The Germans fared even worse, as Swedish exports dwindled and their own deposits proved inadequate. The Reich's factories began hoarding what little tungsten remained for machine tools essential to aircraft production. By 1945, Panther crews faced Allied armor with no HVAP equivalent, just standard steel projectiles, their invincible tanks now vulnerable. For the U.S. Ordnance Department, HVAP had been a long time coming. Experiments had begun as early as 1942, but only after the bloodletting in Normandy did mass production become urgent. In July 1944, just 1,000 HVAP rounds for 3-inch guns used by tank destroyers were produced. The following month brought 1,000 rounds for the new 76mm guns. September yielded another 1,000. Not until November did production finally accelerate to 5,000 rounds per month, climbing to 7,000 by January 1945. By March, roughly 33,000 rounds had been produced, an impressive industrial feat, yet still far short of what the front demanded. For every Sherman crew wading in the mud and smoke of Europe, those tungsten-tipped rounds were more than ammunition. They were hope itself, forged from science, scarcity, and desperation. By February 1945, a grim arithmetic governed the battlefield, as the average 76mm Sherman operating in Europe carried only 5 HVAP rounds, just 5 tungsten-tipped chances against an enemy whose standard tank was now the Panther. A single Sherman company, 17 tanks strong, possessed a total of 85 such rounds to face German Panzer formations, fielding 30 or more Panthers. The first HVAP shipments had reached Europe in August 1944, yet their arrival went almost unnoticed amid the brutal fighting in the Norman hedgerows. There, close-quarters combat turned every field into a death trap. American tanks struggled to maneuver in the tight bocage country where German gunners, masters of camouflage and positioning, waited in ambush. From hull-down positions, the Panthers showed only their thick, unyielding turrets, hiding the more vulnerable hulls beneath the folds of earth. Their first shot was almost always the last word in an engagement. Imagine being a Sherman crewman in that environment. You edge your tank forward, vision restricted, every hedge concealing potential death. The radio crackles with tension, then a flash, a thunderous impact, and a tank ahead of you erupts in flames. The crews gave their own machine a darkly humorous nickname, the Ronson Lighter. "It lights every time," they said grimly, though post-war analysis would later reveal that the Sherman's flammability was overstated. In those fields of France, perception shaped behavior more than fact. Fear became doctrine. Many tank commanders, upon spotting a Panther, instinctively called for artillery or airstrikes rather than risk a direct duel. The initiative, the rhythm of battle itself, shifted to the Germans. The introduction of HVAP ammunition began to change that, but only gradually. Few crews had enough of the precious rounds, and fewer still truly understood how to use them. 6 per tank, that was all. And yet, in the right hands, 6 could be enough. The true test would come not in the hedgerows of Normandy, but on the open plains of Lorraine. By September 1944, Lieutenant General George S. Patton's Third Army was slicing through France. Its supply lines stretched thin, but its momentum relentless. The 4th Armored Division, one of America's finest, had thrust across the Moselle River, carving a bridgehead near a small French village called Arracourt. For the German High Command, this was intolerable. If Patton broke through to the Rhine, the industrial heart of the Reich lay exposed. The counterstroke fell to General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army. His orders were clear: crush the American bridgehead and halt the advance at any cost. The force assembled for the attack was formidable. 2 freshly raised panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th, equipped mainly with brand-new Panther tanks straight from the factories, were committed to the assault. Together, they fielded about 150 tanks against roughly 50 Shermans of Combat Command A, 4th Armored Division. The 113th alone brought 90 armored vehicles into battle, 42 Panthers and 40 Panzer Volks among them. On paper, it looked like a slaughter waiting to happen. German planners were confident. Superior armor, superior guns. What could possibly go wrong? But the Battle of Arracourt, fought from September 18th to 29th, 1944, would prove them profoundly mistaken. It became the largest tank engagement fought by American forces until the Battle of the Bulge, and a stunning demonstration that training, tactics, and coordination could triumph over raw technology. The morning of September 19th dawned under a blanket of heavy fog that clung to the rolling countryside like a shroud. German reconnaissance was virtually blind. Their panzers groped forward without proper scouting units, unaware that American defenders already held the high ground and knew every fold of the terrain. At around 8 o'clock, the leading elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade collided with American outposts east and south of Arracourt. Their Panthers, factory fresh, gleaming, and crewed by men with little combat experience, advanced in column formation, a textbook era that seasoned U.S. tankers instantly recognized and prepared to exploit. Captain Kenneth R. Lamerson's C Company of the 37th Tank Battalion waited along key approaches. His men had been briefed. You have 6 HVAP rounds each. Use them wisely at close range against the turret or the mantlet. The fog muffled sound and sight alike, turning the battlefield into a ghostly labyrinth. Then it happened. Out of the mist loomed a Panther, no more than 75 meters away, so close its engine's growl vibrated through the ground. The American gunner didn't hesitate. He fired one of his precious HVAP rounds. The shell screamed from the barrel at over 1,000 meters per second. In less than a heartbeat, it struck the Panther's gun mantlet. The tungsten core tore through the cast steel, ignited the ammunition stowed beneath the breech, and the German tank vanished in a ball of fire. The turret lifted clear off the hull, spinning as it came to rest. 2 more Panthers emerged almost immediately. Both were destroyed in rapid succession before they could return effective fire. The rest withdrew, stunned. They had been told the Shermans were inferior. Now 3 of their mighty Panthers lay burning in the fog. Across the Arracourt sector that morning, similar encounters unfolded. American tankers turned the fog into their ally, striking at close range where their HVAP rounds could do their lethal work. The Germans, advancing blindly and often in tight formation, exposed their vulnerable flanks time and again. Near the division command post, a platoon of M18 Hellcat tank destroyers joined the fray. Sleek, fast, and armed with the same 76mm gun, and now the same tungsten rounds, the Hellcats darted through the mist like predators. At such ranges, their speed and accuracy were devastating. By midday, the fog began to lift, and the Americans unleashed the full weight of their combined arms doctrine. Forward observers called in artillery fire. Radio operators guided P-47 Thunderbolts from the 405th Fighter Group as they swooped through breaks in the clouds, striking German tanks with rockets and machine guns. The results were unmistakable. The Panther, magnificent in isolation, was never meant to fight alone. The Americans fought as a team, tanks, guns, planes, and men working in concert. That day, in the fields around Arracourt, the myth of German invincibility began to crack. The German counterattack at Arracourt was doomed long before its first Panther crested the fog-shrouded ridge. The reasons were not mysterious, only ignored. German tanks advanced without artillery to soften enemy positions, without infantry to screen for hidden threats, without air cover to keep American fighter bombers at bay. It was armor thrown forward in isolation, stripped of the combined armed synergy that modern warfare demanded. The Americans, by contrast, fought as an orchestra. Tanks, infantry, artillery, tank destroyers, and air power all moved in concert, each note reinforcing the next. It was not the superiority of a single weapon that turned the tide, but the harmony of an integrated system. When German Panthers blundered into these interlocking defenses, their supposed invincibility dissolved one fireball at a time. The HVAP rounds did not magically transform the Sherman into a technological equal of the Panther. Far from it. But battles are not decided on paper. They are decided by men who understand the weaknesses in their enemy's steel and the strength within their own. The Panther's engineering brilliance carried with it subtle flaws. The gun mantlet that allowed its long 75mm cannon to traverse and elevate also formed a vulnerable curve. The joint where turret met hull, the side armor, the engine deck, all offered fleeting, deadly targets. With HVAP ammunition, Sherman crews could exploit those weaknesses from ranges that only weeks earlier had meant suicide. And then came the shock, not in metal, but in minds. For months, German crews had been assured of their dominance. Their briefings told them, "The Americans cannot penetrate your front armor." They were trained to face the enemy head-on with absolute confidence. But on September 19th, that confidence burned away in the fog around Arracourt. Imagine being a Panther commander, trained to believe in your machine's invulnerability, and watching an American shell pierce your mantlet, detonate your ammunition, and hurl your turret skyward. Survivors of those moments carried more than fear back to their units. They carried disbelief. Soon, the reports began to flood in. By that afternoon, German tank commanders were urgently radioing headquarters. The Americans are using new, more powerful ammunition. Confusion spread like wildfire. Some officers insisted the U.S. had secretly fielded 90mm tank destroyers. Others were certain British 17-pounder Firefly tanks had joined the American ranks. The truth? That the Americans had simply developed new tungsten-cored rounds was far more unsettling. It meant that the United States could identify a tactical problem, mobilize its industry, and deliver a solution to the front faster than Germany could respond. The fighting continued through September 22nd. By the time the smoke cleared, German hopes of a breakthrough had evaporated. Of roughly 150 tanks and assault guns committed, 86 lay destroyed or disabled. American losses totaled just 25 Shermans and 7 tank destroyers. The numbers told a stark story. Despite inferior armor and guns, American forces achieved a kill ratio that favored them more than 3-1. The Battle of Arracourt was more than a tactical triumph. It was a turning point of the mind. American crews, once haunted by the Panther shadow, now understood that skill, coordination, and the right ammunition could level the field. They no longer waited passively for tank destroyers or airstrikes to intervene. They fought. They maneuvered. They attacked. For the Germans, Arracourt was a study in disbelief and bitter recrimination. The vaunted 113th Panzer Brigade, which had begun with about 90 armored vehicles, could muster fewer than 20 by September 29th. After-action reports strained to explain the debacle. How had crews in brand-new Panthers, armed with the best tank gun of the war, been annihilated by supposedly inferior machines? Part of the answer lay in experience. The German brigades were manned by hastily trained crews, many with only weeks of instruction before being thrust into battle. Their American adversaries in the 4th Armored Division were hardened veterans, men who had fought their way across France, who knew how to read terrain and coordinate with artillery and air support. But even that could not explain the impossible penetrations found on the battlefield. German intelligence teams inspecting the wrecks were puzzled. The entry holes in Panther armor were too small for standard American shells. Then they found the evidence: unexploded rounds near destroyed tanks, each with a dense tungsten core. The Americans had introduced sub-caliber high-velocity projectiles, the M93 HVAP. The revelation was deeply troubling to German planners. Germany itself had once produced similar ammunition, the Panzergranate 40, also using tungsten. But by late 1944, the Reich's supplies of that precious metal were nearly exhausted. What little remained was diverted to the machine tools vital for aircraft production. Ammunition factories went without. The Americans, by contrast, had both the resources and the industrial might to field tungsten rounds in combat quantities. The implications were immense. The Allies were not only outproducing Germany in tanks and aircraft, they were now matching and countering its technological edge in armor design. Every HVAP round fired in Lorraine was proof of industrial supremacy turned into battlefield advantage. And the psychological ripple effect was even greater. As word spread among American units that the new ammunition could, under the right conditions, punch through a Panther, something fundamental changed. Crews began to fight with renewed confidence. The paralysis of fear that had gripped some units in Normandy melted away. They still respected the Panther, its gun, its armor, its presence, but they no longer worshipped it as invincible. A tank crew that believes it can win fights differently, It takes initiative. It attacks, probes, improvises. It becomes dangerous. And even those who didn't yet have HVAP rounds in their racks drew courage from knowing they existed. Somewhere out there, in the next resupply truck or the next batch of ammunition, lay a round that could even the odds. Commanders now faced agonizing choices about who would get those scarce tungsten treasures. The tank destroyer battalions, whose entire purpose was hunting enemy armor, usually received priority. But in the fields around Arracourt, ordinary Sherman crews proved that with courage, cunning, and a handful of those glittering rounds, the myth of the Panther's invulnerability could be shattered. The allocation of HVAP ammunition was a small war within the larger one. Sherman tanks, the workhorses of the Allied advance, carried a dual burden to support infantry and to face enemy armor head-on. Yet precisely because of that versatility, they often received fewer high-velocity armor-piercing rounds than the dedicated tank destroyers whose missions were narrowly defined. The result was a logistical and tactical friction point, an ongoing tug-of-war between battlefield necessity and the cold arithmetic of supply. From the high command down to the battalion level, distribution was uneven. Some units sat on stockpiles they could not expend quickly enough, while others burned through their limited HVAP caches in days, sending increasingly desperate resupply requests that vanished into the bureaucratic fog of war. It was a recurring irony. The weapon that gave American crews confidence to face German armor was, at the same time, too scarce to be relied upon. That scarcity became critical in December 1944, when the Ardennes erupted into fire and snow. The German counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge, hurled hundreds of Panthers and Tigers into the frozen forests under skies too gray for Allied air cover. For weeks, the weather itself seemed to fight for the Reich. American tank units, isolated amid blizzards and choked roads, faced a resurgent armored enemy with dwindling stocks of HVAP. Some crews expended their last tungsten rounds in the first days of battle. Others never received a resupply at all. Convoys carrying ammunition were ambushed or immobilized by snowdrift and bombed bridges. Yet even under those brutal conditions, American adaptability prevailed. Sherman crews fought in close coordination with infantry, turning every village and forest edge into a trap. Bazooka teams darted through smoke and snow, crippling Panthers from flanking positions, while Shermans poured suppressive fire onto German strong points. Forward observers orchestrated time-on-target artillery barrages, precision strikes that blinded optics, blew tracks from their housings, and cut down crews scrambling from hatches. When the skies finally cleared in late December, the long-grounded thunderbolts and typhoons returned to the air. Their rockets and bombs tore through German columns trapped on narrow roads, shattering the last concentrated armor thrusts. By January, the Bulge had been crushed, and with it, Germany's final illusion of turning back the tide. By early 1945, the balance of the war had shifted beyond recovery. In the West, American and British forces were preparing to cross the Rhine. In the East, the Red Army was rolling inexorably toward Berlin. German industry, bled dry by strategic bombing and territorial loss, could no longer sustain its armored forces. The numbers told a story of collapse. Panther production, which had peaked at nearly 3,900 units in 1944, plummeted as factories burned, supply lines fractured, and raw materials vanished. Even tanks that rolled off assembly lines often never reached the front, or if they did, lacked the fuel to move. By the war's final months, German crews were abandoning pristine tanks simply because their fuel tanks were dry. Still, amid the triumphs, the HVAP story had its shadows. Its success was neither absolute nor simple. The tungsten carbide core, so prized for its hardness, carried its own flaw: brittleness. At lower velocities, especially beyond 300 to 2,500 feet per second, the dense core could shatter on impact rather than penetrate. In practical terms, that meant HVAP's lethality fell sharply at long range. Against the Panther's thick, sloped mantlet, the effective range was roughly 1,000 meters. Beyond that, results were unpredictable at best, disastrous at worst. Crews learned this the hard way, through experience, through trial, and fatal error. Training rarely kept pace with technological innovation. The ammunition reached the front faster than the manuals explaining how to use it. Sergeant Francis Baker's encounter on November 20, 1944, captured this reality vividly. His 76mm Sherman fired 7 HVAP rounds at a Panther 800 yards away, each strike hitting the side armor. Every round ricocheted harmlessly. Baker's frustration was understandable. The engagement exposed HVAP's limitations against sloped armor at unfavorable angles. The Panther eventually withdrew, but the lesson was seared into every crewman who heard the story. HVAPs was not magic. It was a powerful tool, but still one that demanded judgment, patience, and tactical acumen. Crews learned to stalk for flanking shots, to maneuver for side or rear angles, to wait for the moment when armor geometry turned in their favor. A poorly placed HVAP shot was not only a waste of precious tungsten, but an invitation for deadly retaliation from a Panther, whose gun remained lethal at twice the range. After the war, ballistic studies confirmed what the tankers had learned in blood and smoke. HVAP could reliably penetrate the Panther's gun mantlet out to about 1,000 meters and often caused catastrophic internal explosions when it did. But against the glacis, that perfectly sloped 80mm shield of steel, the results were poor. Even tungsten could not easily defeat the physics of sloped armor. Ricochets and shattering cores remained common. For Sherman crews, this meant that the HVAP was never the great equalizer, but it was the great enabler. It turned hopeless duels into winnable ones, provided the range and angle were right. It gave American tankers a fighting chance, and sometimes that was enough. When the Korean War erupted in June 1950, HVAP received its second proving ground. The M4A3E8 Shermans, their suspensions improved and their 7mm guns refined, now faced Soviet-built T-34-85s across the hills of the Korean Peninsula. This time, there was no scarcity. Tungsten supplies were abundant, logistics unbroken, production uninterrupted by strategic bombing. American crews could finally employ HVAP as it had been intended, not as a rare battlefield luxury, but as standard issue. The lessons first written in the fog of Arracourt and the snow of the Ardennes echoed into a new war on a new continent. That technology mattered, but only insofar as it served skill, coordination, and human will. The HVAP round was not just a bullet of tungsten and steel. It was a symbol of adaptation under fire, of industry answering urgency, and of the enduring truth that no weapon, however advanced, substitutes for the courage and intelligence of the men who use it. In Korea, the long shadow of Arracourt finally lifted. American tank crews, veterans of a new kind of war on a new continent, discovered what their predecessors in France had yearned for: abundance. HVAP rounds were no longer the rare, jealously rationed treasures of 1944. They were standard issue, stacked in crates beside every ammunition rack, ready to turn the humble 76mm Sherman into a weapon capable of piercing any Soviet-made tank that rolled into its sights. Against the T-34-85, the results were decisive. The Soviet design, formidable in the early years of the Eastern Front, now faced the same fate the Panther had narrowly avoided. Its 90mm turret front and 45mm glasses could not withstand the velocity and concentrated force of tungsten-cored American rounds. At typical engagement ranges, HVAP shells punched through T-34 armor as though it were an afterthought. Combat reports from Korea recorded exchange ratios that astonished even seasoned officers. Shermans regularly destroyed multiple T-34s for each of their own losses. The reasons were twofold: skill and supply. American crews were better trained, their gunnery sharper, their coordination with infantry and artillery seamless. But the decisive edge lay in what they could fire. The same de la 76mm gun that had struggled in Normandy now performed with devastating effectiveness, vindicated at last by the very ammunition that had been too scarce when it was most desperately needed. For veterans of the European campaign, that realization was bittersweet. The Sherman's final redemption had come 6 years and half a world too late. The German perspective: respect and resentment. Post-war interrogations and captured records revealed that German ordnance officers understood exactly what had happened. The Americans had perfected the tungsten-cored projectile, a weapon Germany itself had pioneered but could not sustain. The Panzer 40, the German tungsten core round, was an impressive technical achievement, but its production had been strangled by material shortages. Each round consumed resources desperately needed for machine tools and industrial production. By late 1944, only limited numbers reached the front, and never in the volumes needed to influence battles. American industry, by contrast, managed to scale production even amid tungsten scarcity. HVAP rounds appeared in small numbers at first, then in growing quantities by the war's final months, enough to tilt the psychological balance, if not the technical one. German tankers who survived the Western Front spoke with a mixture of disbelief and grudging admiration about the new ammunition. It wasn't just that Sherman tanks could now kill Panthers. It was that the myth of Panther invulnerability had been shattered. Crews who had been trained to trust their sloped armor suddenly faced the terrifying reality that American guns could punch through their mantlets at battle range. Reports spread rapidly through the Panzer brigades. The Shermans were firing new miracle rounds. No one was sure what they were, only that the old rules no longer applied. The effect on morale was profound. Panthers that once advanced confidently now fought more cautiously, seeking cover, hesitating where they once charged. The engineers' view, German engineers analyzing HVAP projectiles recovered from wrecks, found themselves studying an elegant solution born of industrial pragmatism. The American design used a dense tungsten carbide core encased in a lightweight aluminum body, an ingenious combination that conserved scarce tungsten without sacrificing performance. The aluminum sections acted as carriers, allowing high muzzle velocity while reducing barrel wear. The result was a round that balanced efficiency, economy, and lethality, something the overextended German war machine could no longer replicate. By late 1944, Germany's strategic priorities had shifted to survival. Tank and ammunition production focused on maintaining existing output, not innovation. The 75mm 42 gun of the Panther was already powerful enough to destroy any Allied tank, so German planners saw little reason to divert precious tungsten or retool bomb-damaged factories for a new ammunition type. The cost of adaptation was simply too high. As a result, the final generation of German tanks fought with ammunition designed in 1942 and 1943, while American ordnance steadily improved through 1944 and beyond. Arracourt's enduring lesson, the Battle of Arracourt, viewed through the long lens of history, became more than a victory. It was a revelation. It proved that modern warfare was no longer won by isolated machines, no matter how superior their engineering. Germany had built extraordinary tanks, but fought with shrinking resources, rushed crews, and a tactical doctrine increasingly divorced from logistical and operational reality. The Americans, by contrast, fought as a system. Tanks supported by infantry, artillery, air power, and an industrial network that could solve battlefield problems in months, not years. HVAP ammunition was the embodiment of that system, the product of a nation that could identify a weakness, mobilize its scientists, and deliver a solution to the front lines before the war's end. For the individual tankers, HVAP was more than a weapon. It was a psychological lifeline. To the crews who had watched rounds bounce uselessly off Panther glasses plates in Normandy, the arrival of tungsten-cored ammunition symbolized hope reborn. It told them that they could fight and win, that their lives no longer depended solely on luck, but on a round capable of piercing even the mightiest of enemy tanks. For their German counterparts, it was the opposite revelation, the moment invincibility dissolved into fear. Otto Carius, the famed Tiger Ace, would later write that the armor's thickness was as much psychological as physical. It gave crews courage, made them aggressive. Once they realized that armor could be penetrated, that death could come even from the front, that confidence vanished. By 1945, the psychological tide had turned as completely as the strategic one. The tungsten-tipped shells of Arracourt and beyond had done more than pierce armor. They had pierced the myth of German superiority itself. The Panther's mantlet, once a symbol of invincibility, became a liability that skilled American crews could deliberately exploit. Each successful strike through that curved armor chipped away not only at steel, but at confidence itself. Panther commanders, once bold and sure of their superiority, began to hesitate. They took longer to engage, lingered in cover, and approached combat with a caution that revealed a subtle but crucial change. Fear had replaced certainty. But beyond the battlefield, the HVAP story illuminated a much deeper truth, one that transcended tactics and even technology. It was the story of industrial willpower as much as scientific ingenuity. Both the United States and Germany had brilliant engineers, gifted metallurgists, and a keen understanding of ballistics. Both grasped the potential of tungsten-cored ammunition early in the war, yet only one nation could turn that understanding into a weapon that arrived in time, in sufficient quantity to matter. In Germany, science outpaced supply. Brilliant concepts withered for lack of resources, strangled by a collapsing industrial base, relentless bombing, and the scarcity of raw materials. In America, industry became an extension of strategy, a living organism capable of adapting to combat realities at unprecedented speed. The HVAP round was not just a product of laboratory research, it was the outcome of an entire nation mobilized behind the idea that quantity has a quality of its own. The numbers tell the story more starkly than words ever could. Germany produced roughly 6,132 Panthers. The United States built 49,324 Shermans, an 8-to-1 ratio that no level of German engineering excellence could offset. When ammunition like HVAP helped narrow the technical gap, even slightly, that industrial advantage became overwhelming. Lessons that outlived the war. The legacy of Arracourt did not end with the last burned-out tank on a foggy French hillside. The men who fought there carried its lessons into the future. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, during that pivotal engagement, would rise to become Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army and lend his name to America's premier battle tank, the M1 Abrams. Abrams never forgot what Arracourt had taught him, that tanks must fight as part of a system, with infantry, artillery, air power, and logistics intertwined, and that ammunition matters as much as armor. The M1's design, with its 100mm smoothbore gun and advanced penetrators made of depleted uranium, reflects those very principles. In a sense, the HVAP's tungsten heart lived on in every Abrams shell fired decades later, a direct descendant of that wartime breakthrough in 1944. Across the former front lines, German veterans who later joined the Bundeswehr drew their own conclusions. They had lived through the bitter irony of possessing technologically superior tanks, only to see them defeated by an enemy whose strength lay in organization, training, and industrial abundance. The post-war German doctrine they helped craft emphasized crew quality, firepower, and ammunition effectiveness over sheer armor thickness. Tanks, like the Leopard 1 and Leopard 2, embodied these lessons, focusing on mobility and the precision of their guns rather than the brute weight of their protection. The war's end and the final reckoning. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the guns fell silent. But American ordnance teams continued their work, studying, measuring, understanding. On the battlefields of France and Germany, they examined wrecked Panthers and found unmistakable proof of HVAP's impact. Clean holes punched through mantlets and turret faces where tungsten had done its work. Yet even these successes underscored HVAP's limits. The Panther's glacis, its iconic sloped front, remained a nearly impregnable barrier unless struck from perilously close range. These findings validated what American doctrine had long insisted. Victory came from tactics, not just tools. Flanking maneuvers, combined arms coordination, and the relentless integration of air, artillery, and armor were what truly broke the Wehrmacht's strength. HVAP had improved the odds, but it was superior logistics, overwhelming numbers, and unshakable morale that decided the outcome. The transformation of the American tanker. Perhaps the most telling transformation was psychological. The men who rolled ashore in Normandy in June 1944 often did so with dread. They had heard the stories, that the Panthers' armor was impenetrable, that their shells would bounce off, that survival in a Sherman meant luck more than skill. But by early 1945, those same soldiers had become something entirely different. Months of combat, the arrival of 7mm Shermans, and the quiet confidence that came with knowing they carried HVAP in their racks had reshaped them. They were no longer tentative. They fought with conviction, calculated aggression, and belief in their ability to win. And that, perhaps more than tungsten, more than steel, was the real weapon that turned the tide. Epilogue: the tungsten legacy. While HVAP ammunition alone did not transform the American armored force, its presence on the battlefield became a catalyst for confidence, a tangible symbol that technology, when paired with determination, could reverse the balance of fear. Every tungsten cored round represented more than metallurgy. It was proof that ingenuity and industry could close the gap between survival and superiority. The influence of HVAP did not end in 1945. Its legacy still courses through the blueprints of modern armored warfare. From the laboratories that built the 76mm HVAP round grew an unbroken lineage of design philosophy that defines tank gunnery to this day. Modern penetrators, whether forged from depleted uranium or tungsten alloys, embody the same principle discovered under wartime urgency. Concentrate maximum kinetic energy into the smallest, densest projectile, driven at the highest possible velocity. This continuity from the M93 HVAP of 1944 to today's armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot APFSDS ammunition forms a technological through-line that connects Arracourt to every modern battlefield. The Soviet Union, and later Russia, independently arrived at the same conclusion, that armor-piercing effectiveness depends as much on material science and energy transfer as on gun design. The entire world's tank ammunition industry traces its intellectual ancestry to the moment engineers first proved that specialized ammunition could offset armor superiority. That moment came on September 19, 1944, near Arracourt, France. In the fog of dawn, First Lieutenant Merwin Marston and his Sherman crew fired the first tungsten-cored rounds in anger against the looming silhouettes of German Panthers. The results reverberated far beyond the smoky fields of Lorraine. In that instant, the myth of German invulnerability cracked. The men inside those Shermans, once convinced that their shots would only bounce off sloped steel, saw their tungsten cores bite through armor once thought untouchable. For American tankers, it was not merely a tactical advantage, it was a moral victory. They no longer faced the enemy as underdogs, but as equals, armed with proof that science and courage could meet technology and fear head-on. For German crews, accustomed to fighting from behind the shield of superior armor, it was the moment doubt entered the turret. The shift was subtle but decisive. From that day onward, the psychological balance of armored warfare tilted. The Panther still struck hard, but the Sherman no longer fought as prey. And in that transformation, born of metallurgical insight, industrial might, and battlefield necessity, lay one of the quiet revolutions of the Second World War. The crews who first loaded those M93 rounds into their Shermans may not have known it, but they were firing the opening shots of a technological lineage that would shape every tank battle for the next 80 years. Their tungsten cores pierced more than armor. They penetrated the myth of invincibility itself. The enduring lesson of Arracourt is not merely about ammunition, it is about adaptation. That when faced with a superior foe, the combination of science, industry, and courage can recalibrate the battlefield. The same principle guides military planners today as they confront the evolving challenges of modern warfare. The materials have changed, the machines have evolved, but the essence remains unchanged. Victory belongs to those who learn, innovate, and dare.